Hello, welcome everyone. We have Rebecca and Curtis joining us. Hi. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Six Bridges Book Festival. I'm your moderator, Stephanie Maxwell Newton, and I'm so excited to be here tonight with authors Rebecca Makkai and Curtis Sittenfeld. First, I'm going to introduce them, let them each read a passage from their books, and then we'll jump into our discussion. With about 15 or 20 minutes left, I'll open it up to the audience. There's a chat function at the bottom of the screen. Click on that, and that's where you can drop your questions. At the end, we'll get to as many as we can, and I hope you'll submit some. All right, let's introduce these talented people. Rebecca Makkai is the author of the New York Times bestseller, I Have Some Questions for You, which was released in February. Her 2018 novel, The Great Believers, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award, and her stories have appeared in the Iowa Review, Tin House, and On This American Life. Rebecca teaches graduate fiction writing and is also artistic director of Story Studio Chicago, part of a nonprofit that helps writers become better storytellers. Curtis Sittenfeld is the best-selling author of 7 novels, including her most recent romantic comedy, here we go, which was named a Reese's Book Club pick this year. Her books have been translated into 30 languages, and her stories and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, Esquire, The Best American Short Stories, and The Atlantic. I have to share my favorite tidbit I found while researching these intros, which is that Curtis has been an answer on Jeopardy 4 times, referencing her novels Prep, Eligible, and Rodham. Thank you both for being here with us this evening. I'm going to hand it off now to Rebecca to read from I Have Some Questions for You.
Sure, thanks. Appreciate it. I am just going to read the very opening of this, which is just like a prologue that is not called a prologue, because if you call it a prologue, nobody reads it. So this is the opening. You've heard of her, I say. A challenge, an assurance, to the woman on the neighboring hotel bar stool who's made the mistake of striking up a conversation, to the dentist who runs out of questions about my kids and asks what I've been up to myself. Sometimes they know her right away. Sometimes they ask, wasn't that the one where the guy kept her in the basement? No, it was not. Wasn't it the one where she was stabbed in? No. The one where she got in a cab with different girl. The one where she went to the frat party, the one where he used a stick, the one where he used a hammer, the one where she picked him up from rehab and no. The one where he'd been watching her jog every day. The one where she made the mistake of telling him her period was late. The one with the uncle. Wait, the other one with the uncle? No, it was the one with the swimming pool. The one with the alcohol in, with her hair around, with the guy who confessed to, right, yes. They nod, comforted. By what? My barstool neighbor pulls the celery from her Bloody Mary, crunches down. My dentist asks me to rinse. They work her name in their mouths, their memories. I definitely know that one, they say. That one, because what is she now but a story to know or not know, a story with a limited set of details, a story to master by memorizing maps and timelines. The one from the boarding school, they say. I remember the one from the video. You knew her? She's the one whose photo pops up if you search New Hampshire murder, alongside mugshots from the meth-addled tragedies of more recent years. One photo, her laughing with her mouth but not her eyes, suggesting some deep unhappiness, tends to feature in clickbait. It's only a cropped shot of the tennis team from the yearbook. If you knew Thalia, it's easy enough to see she wasn't actually upset. was just smiling for the camera when she didn't feel like it. It was the story that got told and retold. It was the one where she was young enough and white enough and pretty enough and rich enough that people paid attention. It was the one where we were all young enough to think someone smarter had the answers. Maybe it was the one we got wrong. Maybe it was the one we all collectively, each bearing only the weight of a feather, got wrong. And I'll stop there.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Curtis, let's hear a little from romantic comedy.
I like Rebecca. I'm also going to read from the beginning. So I don't think it requires very much explanation. You should not, I've read many times, reach for your phone first thing in the morning. The news, social media, and emails all disrupt the natural stages of waking and create stress, which is how I'll preface the fact that when I reached for my phone first thing one morning and learned that Danny Horst and Annabelle Lilly were dating, I was furious. I wasn't furious because I was in love with Danny Horst, or for that matter, with Annabelle Lilly. Nor was I furious because two more people in the world had found romantic bliss while I remained mostly single. And I wasn't furious that I hadn't heard the news directly from Danny, even though we shared an office. The reason I was furious was that Annabelle Lilly was a gorgeous, talented, world-famous movie star, and Danny was a schlub. He wasn't a bad guy, and he too was talented, but for Christ's sake, he was a TV writer, a comedy writer. He was a male version of me. He was pasty-skinned and sleep-deprived and sarcastic. And perhaps because he was male, or perhaps because he was a decade younger than I was, he was a lot less self-consciously people-pleasing and a lot more recklessly crass. And then I'm going to jump ahead a tiny bit, even within this short section. Theirs was the third such pairing that had occurred at TNO in the last few years. And as anyone knows who's ever written a joke or heard a fairy tale or read an article in the style section of a newspaper, there's a rule of three. In this case, it constituted the trend of a romance between a bona fide celebrity and a TNO staffer who'd met on the show. But crucially, a bona fide female celebrity and a male staffer. The year before, at a wedding I'd attended, an icy blonde Oscar-winning British actress named Imogen Wagner had married a cast member named Josh Beekman, best known for his recurring character Backney Guy. And the year before that, the head writer, Elliot Markovitz, 5'8", 40, and my topsider-wearing boss, had married a multi-platinum album-selling pop singer named Nicola Dornan, 5'10", 30, and a special envoy for the UN. And this, of course, was the essence of my fury, that such couples would never exist with the genders switched, that a gorgeous male celebrity would never fall in love with an ordinary, dorky, unkempt woman, never, no matter how clever she was. But I also knew, as I lay in bed glaring at the screen of my phone, Danny and Annabelle's debut as a couple had occurred the night before in the form of making out at the club where Annabelle's 24th birthday party had been held, that I would write about my fury. Just as I always did, I'd turn my feelings into comedy, and that was how I'd cure myself.
Awesome. Thank you so much. First, I just want to say thank you both. I loved both of these books. They're some of the best books I've read this year. I completely devoured them and stayed up late reading them, which is something I haven't done in a while, like past midnight. So that was really fun. And I appreciate you putting them out into the world. So first of all, since y'all both started at the beginning, I think that's a good place to start. Let's talk about why you started your stories the way you did. I'm interested to hear, what were you hoping to set the scene for the larger story you're telling? Did you come up with these beginnings first, or was this something you in your writing came to later to add at the beginning? And whoever wants to
Rebecca, you get to go first. We can alternate.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever, except maybe for a short story, I've never kept, like, the first thing you write is never the first thing the reader reads. And I'm sure there are exceptions to that out there, but I'm always, I teach writing a lot, and I'm always reminding my students of that just, the fact that you wrote that thing down first there's no reason that should be the first thing a reader needs to read, right? So that opening came significantly later. Someone wants me to state my thoughts. That is what I'm doing. I'm not sure what's going on in the chat there. All right. We have a strange chat today. Sorry.
It's okay. You're also working off some jet lag. So
I am working off some jet lag. Yeah. Right. Anyway.
But yeah, in your writing, when did you, how did you come up with this idea of turning, like kind of naming the faceless woman that gets, like they all turn into one story, it sounds like, when you're thinking of true crime. That I thought that was a really interesting way to start the book.
What I'm doing here is I'm really telling one story, right? The story of this book is that there's a woman who returns to her high school, it's a boarding school in New Hampshire, where she's going to teach a class. She's in her 40s, she's going to teach a class for 2 weeks. And her mind is then back on the murder of a classmate her senior year, a murder that very well might have been solved incorrectly. The wrong person might be in prison. And that story is, that was the story I set out to tell. And in telling that, I found this like kind of very frustratingly universal threads of, these are the stories that we hear again and again and again. And so that became a thread that I wanted to return to, this kind of litany of cases like this, and the way that they can overwhelm you in the same way that we have these litanies of stories about, say, police brutality, or litanies of stories about mass shootings. You just get these lists and you go, oh, I remember that one. I don't remember that one. Certain ones kind of haunt you, certain other ones don't. And so once that was really a part of the narrative and a part of the syntax where I'd return to these lists, I decided that I needed to start with that as well.
That's a really powerful start. And Curtis, what about you?
Well, to sort of echo what Rebecca said, I feel like I once had a writing teacher who would refer to, like, I think he said maybe like the first 10 pages of, I don't know if it was like a story or a novel or both, whether the first 10 pages that the writer writes is throat clearing, which always stayed with me. But I have to say, in this case, I wrote it perfectly the first time. No, I don't. I actually think a prologue, I mean, I don't know, like in some ways for me, a prologue is sometimes almost like explaining the book to myself, or like dipping into the book myself, and just, or like maybe experimenting with the tone a little bit. And I remember actually early on, because I think that I've written books that have, I mean, I think there's like definitely things that they have in common with each other, and then ways that they sort of diverge from each other. But I think that the tone is maybe different from book to book more than the subject matter. And I remember sending it to my agent and editor, like sending the prologue that I just read, to almost like give them the flavor, to be like, this is, and that it's very, light, and it's sort of relatively low stakes, and supposed to be, I think, like, when you wake up and you're essentially like looking at celebrity gossip at like 6:20 a.m. or something, like that's the world that the reader, finds themselves in this book. So I actually, I revise like, a huge amount overall, but I do think that the beginning sort of stayed the beginning in this case.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, these books are so different in a lot of ways. Like, people who haven't read them yet but are tuning in might even get that from the beginnings you just read. But I read them knowing these were going to be paired together, and I kept finding these threads that were kind of interestingly similar. And one of those is that both of these books start out in 2018. And I was curious if that was, because simply that's when you started writing the book and you liked that. But I wasn't sure if maybe, that's a particular time. It's post 2016 election. It's pre-COVID. But they both made a point of saying this is 2018, and then later we get to 2020. So Curtis, maybe we'll go first with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that actually, you can sort of, sometimes fiction exists in a sort of nebulous present day, but if it's in a specific present day, pretty dramatic things have happened in the last few years, and especially the pandemic, where I started writing this book in the summer of 2021. It was really my own pandemic escape. Like, I had been writing sort of a more serious book and kind of wrote myself into a corner with that. So that was, instead of the prologue having to rewrite, I had to rewrite the entire book. But I think that, and the pandemic does make, a real appearance in romantic comedy, even though it's supposed to be like a fun book. But I think that I felt like there were two reasons that I sort of, made this 2018 start and 2020 jump to 2020. One was that that passage of time kind of, it's this writer for a Saturday Night Live show and then the dreamy, handsome pop star who's the musical guest and the host for that week. And they have this week of working together on the show. And, she feels like they're attracted to each other and they're flirting, but because of her own insecurities, she can't believe that he would really be interested in her. And she sort of self-sabotages. And then 2 years pass, which is enough time that they don't really stop thinking about each other, and they both realize that they haven't really stopped thinking about each other. And then when the pandemic occurs, it's, he has such a public life and she has a less public life, but she's sort of working crazy hours in this TV studio, and both of them are totally removed from their normal lives and much less busy and more isolated than they've been, for a good 15 years, if not longer. And they start emailing each other and flirting and sort of reconnecting. So, I mean, the pandemic turned into a literal plot point, and they had, they were evaluating their lives. And, but also, I think as a writer, it was a moment where it didn't feel like we had clearly gotten to the other side. I mean, I don't think we still have clearly gotten to the other side, but I almost felt like, I guess maybe I had to and actually, Rebecca, I'd be interested in what you think of this. Do you think a person could write a book set in a fiction that's realistic, that's set in 2022 or 2023 and not mention the pandemic at all?
Well, yeah, 2023, I guess, right? But yeah, well, because for me, I started writing in 2019, and then the pandemic was happening, and I was like, oh, well, I'm just going to move this back and make it 2018. And then I knew I was going to jump ahead, and I was like, I'm going to set it in 2022 when surely the pandemic will be completely over. And this is how I will avoid this subject. Absolutely. And then, it's getting closer and closer to 2022, and I'm doing edits, and it's I was like, oh, I guess I have to address this, right? I can't, even a year ago or a year and a half ago now, you could not write your way around that. So I went through and I'm sticking masks on everybody, and I'm making this all work. And then time actually caught up with my novel. I was doing copy edits in March of 2022, which was the time I was writing about. And that's right when New Hampshire lifted its mask mandate and things were, so I went back through and took all the masks off of people, left them on some people.
Yeah, I remember that being a thing about who's wearing them and not, or something. And in the court,
it just became a little and I think it's less of a thing in my book than, it's not a major mover of plot, but it became okay, let's imagine these were real people. Well, then this court proceeding we're talking about would have been delayed, and travel would be complicated, and just kind of going to go with it. But
Yeah.
I think what you said at the beginning, Curtis, I think that more like the past few years more than ever now is a really specific and fraught thing. Because I think if you were writing a book in like 1995, you could just be like, yeah, it's now-ish. But 2016 is so different from 2018, so different from 2020, so different. So you got to commit, or you've got to commit to being really, really vague. And just this isn't the real world. But we're both writing things that are so rooted in the real world, then you have to be like, it was Wednesday, September 15th.
I totally feel that way.
Well, and as a reader, it worked. I enjoyed that, those touchstones that were pretty relatable of these things were happening. I can't imagine having gone through what this character's doing during that time or something. So,
yeah.
Okay, well, what was it like finding the voice for each of your main characters in these books, Sally and Bodhi? They were both I felt like I was in their heads a lot of the time. Y'all did a great job creating those characters. So tell me a little bit about getting into that headspace.
And they're both first person too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Kick that to who went first? Maybe this one's Rebecca first.
Okay, yeah. It's been a while since I wrote something in first person. Actually, my first novel was a book called The Borrower. That was in first person. And then other than a couple short stories or a personal memoir, I have, this is now book 5. I have not had any other first person. Partly, I think I was a little not scarred. That's the wrong thing, but especially with the first book, it coming out and it's in first person, people really assumed a lot of autobiography. That's a book about someone who kidnaps a child, which is really disturbing, but assumed a similarity of personality or opinion.
Yeah.
I was very, I didn't love that. And I think it's natural when that's your first book and that's the first thing people see of you is oh, this is you, right? So it was a little bit trepidatious getting back into that with first person, especially in this case, writing about someone, my age and, which is definitely really not me, but demographically could be mistakable for me. But then, to sink into that, there are some ways in which first person can come easier because you're just kind of acting. You just kind of get into a character, you get into a mode, and you're like, this is this person's voice. Like I said, I started writing in 2019. I was really thinking about it for a year before that. So maybe I started in 2018. And I think a lot of the, mixed in with with the story I was telling, there is a lot of stuff in this book about Me Too. And about this character's kind of stewing in that moment of the early days of Me Too and the anger. And that came out in many different ways in this book, one of which was that as I started writing, it took on the form of a direct address. So this is a first person book, but it's also a second person book. And there's a specific character who's being spoken to, kind of the book is being thought at, this one person. And I think that almost that kind of accusatory tone, that I think came out of me allowing myself to channel some of my own vibes and processing in the time when I was writing it. It's definitely not exactly my voice, but you tap into certain parts of yourself. And just germane to what we were just talking about, I think that part of myself had a lot to do with when I was writing it.
Curtis, what about you? Has your writing been largely first person, or was this different for you? How'd you get into Sally?
I've done both. I actually think I prefer first person, for a couple of reasons. What Rebecca is saying is definitely true. I mean, it will encourage people more than they already do to assume it's autobiographical if the protagonist is demographically similar at all to the writer. But I think that for the ways that I feel like my characters are not like me, it almost helps me like put on the costume of the character, or like it's almost like I'm climbing inside. I mean, this sounds almost creepy. I was gonna say climbing inside their clothing, maybe borrowing their clothes.
I thought you were going to say skin. That was going to be way creepier.
Well, no, sometimes I actually think sometimes I feel like this about the protagonist, and sometimes I feel like about the whole book. Like I almost feel like I'm like a high school student who is the mascot, so it's like I'm inside it, but I'm like disguised or whatever. And I think the first person really helps me, like especially, you know, if like I wrote a book that was sort of a fictional retelling of the life of Laura Bush, and it like helped me to kind of put on my Laura Bush costume for there to be first person. And then I think I also like a friend of mine made the observation recently, which I was like, oh, like it felt so insightful, that she was like, your books have a very like confiding tone. And I think that the first person can also encourage that, which is like, I mean, I think that's a tone I like in life and in other people's fiction. And it, you know, I think I try to cultivate that in my own fiction to like make it feel very personal and intimate, even though again, it is fiction. But so for all those reasons, I love the first person as a reader and writer.
I like the disclaimers. This is fiction, you guys, just so you know. Okay, so since we're talking about these characters, what about writing their flaws? How do you find that balance where readers would root for Bodhi and Sally, but also see them as realistic, kind of flawed individuals?
Is it my turn? I feel like it's like the back-to-back thing.
We don't have to be like that precise, but yes, it is your turn.
I mean, well, so somewhat strangely, because you know, my books are not like super plot heavy. Like I like to think they have plots, but it isn't like there haven't so far been murders, or there's not, you know, like it's not like such high stakes. It's almost more like emotional high stakes or something. But I think that I actually do think almost like primarily in terms of plot or external action, and then I think character kind of evolves from that, or like just kind of getting the character through a scene. And then I'll think like, what would she say? What would she do? But I'm not really like almost like doing, I don't know, like a mood board or something,
Character
or like
study
a personality test or something. Which I mean, I don't think there's any right or wrong way to do it. It's more that, again, I feel like I think that I am trying to kind of like tell some story, and the stuff that I end up talking about when I'm discussing the book, you know, like which might be almost like observations or, you know, character development or like social commentary, it just bubbles up in a sort of incidental way. And it's not, I never have stepped back. Like the thing that I say to myself is like, I have to figure out what happens next and what happens next. But I never say like, I have to, I mean, sometimes I guess, you know, there's some element of like a character is this way. And so I'll think, okay, but why? Like, is it, you know, did something happen in the past? But yeah.
Yeah.
Rebecca.
I mean, that the way you phrase that question, you know, talking about that balance of like, we're rooting for them, but they're flawed. Like no one wants to read a perfect character.
Right.
But like in real life, you meet someone who's perfect, you don't like them. Like that's
no.
hang out with. But I think my concern there is not, you know, it's not to make them, you know, to give them like appealing quality necessarily, but to make sure you understand why they're doing what they're doing. You know, if we can get behind that character's reasoning and their motivation and like, what do they need? What do they want? What do they fear? Why are they acting the way they're acting? It's not that you like them necessarily, it's that you're with them. And you could be reading against what they want, right? Because you could be reading about like a serial killer or something. It's not that you are rooting for them, but you are kind of fundamentally aligned with their point of view for the duration of the book. And they're gonna be flawed. Like I've never been tempted to make a character like perfect. It's never gonna
they'd be boring.
Right.
Yeah.
It's always gonna skew in the direction of like, oh, this person's really fucked up. And then my job is just like, but do you understand why? Do you understand how? Like we all in real life, we have people we care a great deal about or we're invested in who are really fucked up. Like your friend who just keeps making the same mistake again and again, or this person that you like, the celebrity that you kind of hate, but you're like always want to know like what they're dating and what's going on, right? So it's I think that it's, I don't know. I think there are a few readers out there, because I've like, you hear from them once in a while, like at festivals and stuff, where they apparently really are reading in order to find like a paragon of virtue on the page. Like they really need a character who's going to like show them how to be a better person, and teach them how to live. And like, there's some memoirs that are good for that. I don't think most fiction is really going to like float your boat if that's what you're reading for. So I think most people are reading for that flaw, for that real human three-dimensionality anyway. So it's just a matter of making their motivations clear. And in this case, like we're stuck in the present with Bodhi, with my character, but I do spend a lot of time explaining like what happened in high school, what is
with her family.
But her family and all that stuff too. But it's, it's not like, because this is a book that's so much about the past, about someone in the present looking back on the past, it's not like I needed to find ways to be like, well, the reason she's like this is because her gerbil died when she was, I'm going to show you this little flashback. It was already a really logical thing to be talking about this very formative period of her life, her adolescence. And, looking back on anyone's adolescence would tell you a great deal about why they are the way they are.
Yeah, it's so true. I have become known in my book clubs for really missing the characters that everyone else hates after we're done with the book. Did y'all watch Succession? That was one of those that afterward I was like, God, I miss them so much. People are like, how can you miss them? I'm like, they're just so awful. I love them. Okay, because Curtis, you mentioned something about plot and what you're doing to move things forward. I thought we could talk a little about genre. And, both of these they're literary fiction and not really like rooted in a specific genre, but I feel like they both very much like flirt around with either romance or thriller. They're alluding to them, but kind of like bending the rules a little bit. So tell us about working either within or against some of those conventions of what people might expect when they were to pick up your book.
I think you should go first again, because I just talked for 2 hours.
So it's funny. I think that the categories of books are primarily like marketing categories, I suppose library categories too. And they're not something that I think I would say that actually this maybe I'm wrong even as I say this, but I was going to say they're not something that most readers and most writers think about. I think there definitely are some, and the part that I'm not sure is like, is it a majority do think about that or a majority don't think? So I mean, I feel like personally, I sort of write the book that I want to write, which is like something I'm so lucky that I get to do. And then it's kind of like my publisher and the world tell me what I've done. So it's like with my first book, it was like, you've written a literary coming of age novel. and then like, sometimes it'll be like, like Rodham, some people would say like, oh, you wrote an alternate history, or some people would say you wrote fan fiction. And I think there's actually ways that, both of those like are accurate. And I think that romantic comedy, I think, is a romance. Like I don't think it's flirting with romance. I think it's having a romance with a romance. But,
right there in the name.
But yeah, it's I mean, it's interesting to see sort of like something that's been interesting to me is I from a very young age, I read like Harlequin romances, and I read what was then called bodice rippers that I think are now called vintage romances. And I loved like, the Nora Ephron romantic comedies that I saw in the theater as a teenager, the very, speaking of like, if you could see us in high school, like explains everything about why we are the way we are. So I do feel like the romance structure and form are kind of in my bloodstream. Something that's been interesting with this publication is, the romance reading and writing community is like very robust and very online and very varied. And I think that they're like, sometimes like some people have said like, oh, you've subverted the romance. And it's like, I haven't really subverted, like the romance has been subverted and is being subverted by lots of people. And there's like so many, like there's like lots of queer romances and, lots of sort of sci-fi romances. And there's just like a lot going on that I think people who don't read it very much don't know. And I would say, I mean, I hope I've done a good job. I think this is like a fairly conventional romance in a lot of ways. But I definitely do think it is a romance. Like it's primarily, the primary plot is two people falling in love.
And I loved it so much.
Thank you. You're supposed to. No.
Yeah. Rebecca.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think that first and foremost, this is a book that is about genre rather than of the genre. Specifically, it's about the true crime genre. And that's a genre that it fundamentally can't participate in because it is fiction, but that it is about, right? Like this idea of the story that becomes public property, the story that everyone's drawn to, the story we want to hear, the structure that it tends to have, the parts of it that we don't want to look at. And I really wanted to basically take exactly the kind of case that we're used to hearing as a true crime story. We're used to hearing in this kind of sensationalized way, and to look at it through like a hyper realist lens. Like, let's take that case of the beautiful, young, rich, etc. That like, it's like the perfect victim. Let's actually look at, okay, what does that kind of attention do to a case, to the investigation, to the victim, to the family, to the suspect, etc. What does it mean when a case becomes, people feel ownership over it online, and just to kind of lean into that. I'm someone who is really drawn to true crime stories. I never read a romance novel as a kid. I tried once. I got like a cheesy romance novel from a church rummage sale, and I was like, "Ooh, this is supposed to be like sexy." And I got like 2 pages in, and I was like, "I don't like this." But I would have totally like any, dark, like mysterious, like true crime, spontaneous combustion, disappeared people, murder. Would have totally read those. But so yeah, it explains everything about both of us probably. But so it's like I'm drawn to that, but I'm also very disturbed by this genre. I have a lot of questions about, those of us who are drawn to this. Why? What do we get out of it? What good can that do? What bad does it do? So I wanted to explore that. And then I end up, it's like, well, okay, now I have a murder mystery essentially. And to what extent am I interested in participating in the conventions of the murder mystery, which is not something I really read. I've read like 2 or 3 Agatha Christie's. I'm not, that's, it's not, I think it's amazing that they're there. I love the ones I read. I think those writers are really smart. I think those readers are really smart. It's not like a turn up my nose at a genre. It's just that that's not what I'm steeped in. But the thing is, there are certain genres that are only genres, right? Like the vampire story,
Yeah.
only a genre, not a real thing. The zombie story, only a genre. And then there are things like a love story or like a murder mystery that they can be a genre, but those are also real life things. Like people actually fall in love in real life. People in real life are murdered, and we need to figure out what already happened here, and we hope we get it right. And so, like, you know, by writing about one of those things, you're not necessarily entering into that genre, so much as you're writing about this thing it is a part of real life. The one thing that I decided going in was I really want to make it clear by the end of the book who did it. That doesn't mean I want all the threads tied up neatly, because like I said, I want a realist book.
Right.
But I was not going to write the book that is, you know, really a murder mystery and then leave it as like, and we'll never know.
Yeah.
Isn't that?
Yeah.
Because I would not be satisfied by a book like that. So I wanted to try to see if I could have it both ways, like to solve this for the reader and for the main character without necessarily putting like a nice Perry Mason Law and Order kind of ending on it, which I hope I did, like, you know, kind of scratching that one itch, but then otherwise not really being too terribly interested in participating in the genre of mystery, more making this a novel about the genre of true crime.
Right. I liked those chapters where you were it was like a pause to, okay, let's look through, was it this friend, was it this ex-boyfriend, was it me? That was really interesting. And we've got a question in the chat that I think is kind of around that, and it is for Rebecca, so we'll jump over to that. Barry asks, the shift from Bodhi speaking to the reader to Bodhi speaking to the music teacher was initially jarring and confusing, but then it put me into a different receptiveness as I read. Was that your intention?
Yeah, it's kind of, you know, basically the end of the first chapter, not the prologue, which I read, but like the actual first chapter. She, you know, is just coming out second person direct address, and talking to this you who is not the reader. It's very clearly, you know, very established that this is the music teacher at the school that she's speaking to. And yeah, you know, I think that in the same way that I think it's like that vibe of like, if you remember, like when you were a kid and you're sitting in class and the teacher is like asking a question and then suddenly you realize they were talking to you.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh shit, wait, what did I do? Like, what am I supposed to do now? It's weird because it's almost the reverse. It's like, no, I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to this other person. But still putting the word you on the page, I think even though you know that you're not the you who's being spoken to, I do feel like as a reader, you feel this kind of shiver of indictment as you are being addressed, even though you're not actually the music teacher at this school that doesn't exist. But yeah, you know, I certainly, you know, there's another, in an alternate world, I could have started this book with like, dear Mr. Black, and made it very, very clear from the outset. So my holding off on that until certain moments and then kind of building what that meant, that was of course very intentional. And, you know, it's again, it's not a letter to him. It's just kind of thought at him in the way that sometimes you lie awake at night and think a whole 90-page thing at someone. And that's kind of the mode.
That's so relatable. Here we have a question. How do y'all feel about questions about previous works? Is that all right?
If I can see, is that Kevin's question?
Oh, I did see that. I was going to ask Anna Grace had a question, I think, about eligible.
I'm happy to answer.
Go for it. All right.
Yeah.
Anna Grace wants to know, was there anything you were nervous about when taking on a Pride and Prejudice retelling? And I'll ask her other question later.
I mean, sure. Like I think that actually I've done this with a few of my books, where I sort of like establish ground rules that allow me to write the book that I want to write. And a lot of them are like with Eligible, which, is a modern day, or it's now set 10 years ago in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I grew up, but like a sort of retelling of Pride and Prejudice. These two British editors had approached me and asked if I wanted to do it. And it sort of felt like, if this is dangled in front of you, there's like only one response. It's like a publisher's like, we want you to spend 2 years in the world of Pride and Prejudice, and then we'll support your effort. But my rule for myself was sort of like, this is an homage. Like, I don't think that I'm announcing to the world that like I'm the second coming of Jane Austen, but this is like fun. And of course, the sort of, I don't know if this is ironic, but like once the book is published, no one besides me knows what those liberating ground rules were. So, someone can interpret the book however they want to. And actually romantic comedy is kind of similar, where I'm not a professional comedy writer. And I knew, even calling it romantic comedy, I knew that some people would find it irresistible to say like, this is neither romantic nor comedic. And indeed, some people have said that. So I feel like, so I think some people were like, you've never worked for SNL, like how can you have the nerve to sort of make reference to these sketches or set things like on these stages or in the studio. And again, I kind of feel like, I do a ton of research, and I believe in my own competence or ability to write scenes. Like I'm not really making that many promises beyond that, but I'm like, I can find, or like with my book Rodham, a lot of it is about like very high level political campaigns. And so I was like, I can figure out how a person runs for Senate or something like that, or like what their campaign staff is and when they hire people and like what they're, so I think some of it is, it's like a weird combination of being, with Pride and Prejudice or with Eligible or with anything else, like being very thorough and responsible about the things I can research. But then also not taking the project too seriously, or like not worrying too much about how it will be interpreted, because of course there's nothing I could write that would get like universal praise. So if someone says like, I love Pride and Prejudice and I hated Eligible, it's not like if I had written a different book, no one would have hated it. It's all subjective.
Yeah. I've got kind of a follow-up that is a good tie-in with that. You mentioned research. Candy wants to know about the opportunity to, did you have any interaction with the SNL cast as research? Did you watch a lot of SNL? And I'd also like to hear from Rebecca about your engagement with true crime podcasts, because you both were kind of delving into these forms of medium that are really popular. And I was curious how much y'all needed to surround yourself with those before writing these stories.
Rebecca, do you want to answer the research question first?
That first, yeah. The podcast thing is not anything I really needed to research. I had been listening to some. It was kind of a good excuse to keep listening and listen to other ones. Where I did have to do a lot of research was the criminal justice system in New Hampshire, very specifically, like appellate court. There's just a lot of like New Hampshire State Prison for Men. I was not interested in the movie version of the criminal justice system. I wanted to represent the actual kind of Kafkaesque, hellacious tedium and impossibility of actual appellate law. Like, someone's convicted, what are the, how possible is it to even remotely get to a hearing that would then lead to a retrial? Like, so I had an amazing public defender from New Hampshire help me out. But the podcast world is just like turn on a podcast and listen and see what they're doing. It's kind of it. And then the boarding school world, because this is about a boarding school, I live on campus at the boarding school where my husband teaches, and I've lived here for
right.
22 years. So hold on, this is my office. I don't think I'm going to like disconnect by doing this. That's like my house. That is the door to a dorm of 40 teenage girls.
No.
I can hear them right now. You can't, because the Zoom has a good sound blocking. So
Wow.
it's like, I didn't, not something I needed to research, which was
right. Can't escape it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly. The Great Believers was extremely research heavy for me. And this was my attempt to write a much less research heavy book. So the law stuff was, and prison stuff was kind of one corner of that, but significantly less research than my previous book.
Gotcha.
Intentionally.
Yeah. Curtis, what about you? Saturday Night Live cast.
Well, okay, so the short answer to did I spend time with the SNL cast? only in my dreams. No, I did. I did attend a dress rehearsal, which is immediately prior to the live show, and is actually a little bit longer because a few sketches get cut for time. By that point, I was probably 90% finished with the book, and I live in Minneapolis, and I had been trying to get tickets and sort of presumptuously thinking, like I've worked with a big agency for a long time, and I thought like they can easily get them. And it was in fact my agent, but who was like lovely and in the face of my persistence, but she was like, those tickets are actually hard to get. And so I was actually with one of my kids in Target, and I think it was a Tuesday, and she was like, if you come like this Saturday, I can get you like a ticket for the dress rehearsal. And in that moment in Target, I was like, I can't, like it's too much. I have like inertia or whatever. And then I was like, if I don't go, I'm never going to get inside that studio. And so I did end up going. And it was also like, yeah, I mean, it was like there was a storm that came, and all. So even until the moment I like landed in New York, which I think I went for 17 hours or something. But anyway, unfortunately, not 17 hours at SNL, 17 hours in New York. But I did do a ton of research, and actually, one of the things that made me feel like I was on the right track with this book was that the research was such a joy to do, where it was listening to podcasts of like comedians interviewing each other. It's like Conan O'Brien interviewing David Spade, and then it's like David Spade interviewing Conan O'Brien on a different podcast. But they're actually the very SNL specific podcast, Fly on the Wall, came into existence during the time I was writing the book, which was hosted by David Spade and Dana Carvey. And then, but there's like Mike Birbiglia's Working It Out, where he and the guests kind of test new jokes, and he often has people from SNL and Mark Maron. And so that was very fun. There's like an oral history of SNL that goes back to 1975. There's a documentary made by James Franco, like a sort of low budget documentary about kind of a week in the life of the show. There's so many memoirs by current and former cast members. So there was, an abundance of information. And then I ultimately did interview two people who had worked on the show in the recent past. But it's like, that's not quite the same as like hanging out with, Kate McKinnon and Adie Bryant.
Yes. Gosh, I could not see Pete Davidson and Danny Horst. I don't know how intentional that was, but
I was picturing someone totally different. Oh, that's funny.
Who were you picturing?
I can't remember his name. There's some like kind of just schlubby white guy from like
from SNL.
Yeah.
I think I'm afraid to say, I think I kind of have a suspicion of who you think, Rebecca, but I mean, I'm not so sure that this book would exist without Pete Davidson, but I don't think that I wrote a novel about Pete Davidson. It's more there obviously there is. I mean, I will, of course, in the fullness of time. There is this real phenomenon of sort of men from the show like dating up or dating, but I feel like that was sort of like the germ. That's it's not supposed to be like a thinly veiled depiction of
Pete Davidson book.
But although I also will say, I mean, one I'll say that to me Pete Davidson is very endearing, And two, I now spend a lot of time talking about Pete Davidson, and I find it very enjoyable. I mean, I'm 48, so I'm not like it seems like Pete Davidson is,
there's no age
upper
limit.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not actually the thing that I think is really enjoyable is that a lot of women have very strong opinions where they're like, if given the opportunity to date him, I'd be so thrilled. And then other people are like, I just don't see it. And I feel that I'm in this like midpoint where it's not like I'm yearning, which I think is good, because I don't think he's yearning to have a relationship with me. But I can see why a person would or wouldn't want to be involved. Although again, I come down more on the side of like finding him very charming.
Yeah.
From a distance on my TV screen.
This is so funny. Okay, I want to hop back to a question. We're almost out of time. There are more questions in the chat. I really wish we could get to all of them. But since we are running out, I'm going to ask one that I think the audience usually really likes to hear, which is a book you've recently read that you loved. What comes to mind? Rebecca?
Oh boy.
Doesn't even have to be recent. Just,
I know.
This is the hardest question of all.
I know.
I'm doing a project right now where I'm reading my way around the world in translation, like trying to circle the globe. And it's a memorial to my father in part. He was a linguist and he lived to be 84. So I'm trying to do 84 books.
Oh, wow.
And I'm writing about it like on my Substack and social media. I have a lot of people reading with me if anyone's interested. But I started in Hungary because my dad was Hungarian, so I'm kind of going from there. And right now I'm in the Arabian Peninsula. But the one that I'll say is the Turkish novel that I just read. It's from like the early 1940s. It's called Madonna in a Fur Coat. And it is a really wonderful, very wonderful, tragic love story. And it's like very, very readable. As you think like Turkish novel from the 40s, you don't really know. It's very readable. It was totally overlooked in its day, and the author was murdered by the government and all that stuff. But then for the past like 5 years, it's been one of the best-selling novels suddenly in Turkey. People rediscovered it. It really like bends gender norms in a really interesting way. And they have a very oppressive government right now in that regard. So I think young readers are going to it. But it's like there are a few things where you're kind of cringily out of date, but only a couple. And like it is a really, really beautiful novel. So that is like one of the best things I've read in that journey so far. And since we're talking about love stories, partly that just put me in mind of that.
And that was Madonna in a Fur Coat.
Yeah, it's Sabahattin Ali is the author.
Okay.
Rebecca, are you going to write like a memoir about this?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm like writing about each book now, just, like writing up on my Substack kind of thoughts. And then either it'll be like a long form article, or it might be a memoir that's both about that and about my dad and about like, like other stuff rather, not just like, here's a list of 84 books I read. But
yeah, that sounds fascinating.
It's been really interesting.
Yeah.
The book that came out in January 2023 is called Brotherless Night by Vivi Ganeshananthan, and it's which you could just remember Brotherless Night, but it's about the Sri Lankan Civil War, which is a topic I didn't know anything about, and it's very like beautifully written and insightful, and sort of, I don't know, I felt like I've never been to Sri Lanka, but like it kind of made me feel like to some tiny degree I have, so I loved it. Brotherless Night.
Yeah. Now I don't know how much time, like how close we can get to this 9 o'clock cutoff before they kick us off. But I just want to say there are tons of comments in the chat telling y'all how much they love these books and your previous works. And thank you for being here. So really appreciate it.
And I see, by the way, I see our fellow author, Kevin Brockmeyer in the chat. Lovely to see you, Kevin. And Arkansas, like a native son of Arkansas. I wish we were all together in person. I know I came to this, I think, a few years ago in person and would love to come back.
And Rebecca mentioned she did too.
Same,
Yeah.
You both
That
came
was a
in
while
an
ago.
earlier iteration, the Arkansas Literary Festival, but we'll have to have you back hopefully in person sometime soon.
I would love that.
Okay,
I remember there being
before
really good food in Little Rock. Sorry.
really good food. Good to hear. I'm
Yes.
glad. Want
I
y'all
know
to
we
love it.
didn't end up discussing this, but I feel like I did a lot of research about Arkansas, like in this when I was writing my novel Rodham, and
of course.
Yeah.
like I feel like I kind of meant to take a road trip and never did, so
Yeah.
that still awaits me.
Yeah, y'all come back anytime, please.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks you guys so much for being here. I appreciate it so much. And to our audience for tuning in. I will say the Six Bridges Book Fest continues through this Sunday, October 1st. The schedule is out there. It's got many wonderful in-person events coming up. And thanks to all the sponsors of the festival and supporters of the Central Arkansas Library System. So one big last thank you to Curtis and Rebecca for joining us. Y'all have been really great and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Have a good night.